Happy Halloween from Abe and Frank.
Today, we're summarizing the second half of Chapter 15, The Ferment and Reform of American Culture. I'll start us off with wilderness utopias. The first example we have is Robert Owen trying to create the perfect society in his New Harmony settlement in Indiana in 1825, but it quickly broke down. So, another example can be found in the Transcendentalist Brook Farm, which lasted for 5 years. Transcendentalists believed in the strength of the individual and the power of nature. Nevertheless, after 5 years, Brook Farm broke down. Third, let's look to the Oneida College, which was a creepy eugenic society trying to create superior offspring. After a few years, it broke down. And fourth and finally, another community known as the Shakers didn't allow for marriage or sex, and therefore couldn't reproduce, died out, and broke down. So, Abe, perhaps let's get a little bit more optimistic. Let's look at the dawn of scientific achievement.
All right. Early Americans focused more on inventing practical tools rather than pure science itself. But let's discuss a few of the most noteworthy scientists. Nathaniel Bowditch wrote on practical navigation, and Matthew Maury wrote on ocean winds and currents. However, the most influential scientist in the early 1800s was Benjamin Silliman, a geologist and chemist who wrote at Yale College. The naturalist John J. Audubon wrote the famous Birds of America, and the Audubon Society for Bird Protection was named after him. Transitioning to the medical field, American medicine was still employing primitive cures, such as bleeding. Life expectancy was therefore short, and many suffered from decaying teeth. Fad diets and self-prescribed medicines were popular, such as Robertson's infallible worm-destroying lozenges. No form of anesthesia existed, so surgeries were brutal. But in the early 1840s, laughing gas was finally employed successfully. So, Frank, could you tell me about the artistic achievements in America at this time?
I certainly can. The traditional view of American art was that it was simply an imitation of the European style. However, starting in the mid-1800s, there was a revival of the Grecian style, since Greece had just gained independence from the Ottoman Empire. Surprisingly, Thomas Jefferson was one of America's ablest architects, designing such structures as the University of Virginia. On the whole, overriding Puritan spirit of America viewed art as a waste of time, but some notable artists still emerged. Gilbert Stuart painted George Washington. Charles Willson Peale painted portraits of George Washington. And John Trumbull painted the Revolutionary War, including George Washington. However, art experienced an upswing in popularity in the wake of 1812 and the onset of greater nationalism. The art then focused on romantic styles, taught in the Hudson River School. In terms of music, Americans began to embrace non-religious songs, known as darky tunes, sung during minstrel shows in the South. Stephen Foster's folk songs such as Old Folks at Home and My Old Kentucky Home gained popularity, as American nationalism induced those to listen to more and more non-religious music. But Abe, can you extrapolate on what American literature was like at this time?
All right. Overall, much of America's reading material was copied or imported from Britain. There were, however, some noteworthy American political works, such as The Federalist, Common Sense, and Ben Franklin's autobiography. Good job. But after the War of 1812, American literature surfed in on the wave of nationalism. Washington Irving was the first American who won intellectual recognition for his literature. In his works, Irving used a pleasant style with charm and humor, and overall helped to interpret America to Europe and Europe to America. James Fenimore Cooper was the first American novelist, remembered mostly for his leather-stocking tales. Cooper explored America's Republican experiment and contrasted the values of natural men with modern civilization's artificiality. William Cullen Bryant was the last surfer and authored Thanatopsis, one of the most high-quality poems produced in America. So, Frank, could you tell me about my most favorited literary movement, Transcendentalism?
Of course I can. Trumpeters of Transcendentalism. Now, anyone who's taking or has taken honors English can just skip this section. But if you haven't taken that delightful course, Transcendentalism started in the 1830s with a few basic tenets. The first one was self-reliance. Second, individualism. And third, non-conformity. But Abe, who were famous transcendentalist authors, you ask? Well, I'll tell you. First on our list is Ralph Waldo Emerson, known as the American Scholar. He wanted American authors to create a writing style individual and unique from Europe, which he proposed in his most famous essay, Self-Reliance, along with his love of nature. The second on our list is Henry David Thoreau, who argued against slavery and, in his magnum opus Walden, in favor of traditional transcendentalist ideals, such as self-reliance and individualism. He was also ahead of his time, arguing in favor of civil disobedience tactics, the same type of tactics used later by Martin Luther King and Gandhi. And third on our list is Walt Whitman, whose Leaves of Grass earned him the title of Poet Laureate of Democracy. But Abe, can you tell me about other authors who were non-transcendentalists?
Yes, let's begin with Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, one of the most popular poets. Longfellow was embraced by the less cultured masses, and his most admired poems were based on American traditions rather than European. John Greenleaf Whittier cried out against inhumanity and injustice and is remembered as the poet of human freedom for his abolitionist tendencies. James Russell Lowell, in his Bigelow Papers, condemned plans for slavery expansion, so both of these were against slavery. Dr. Oliver Wendell Holmes was a nonconformist and a captivating conversationalist who is most remembered for his poem, The Last Leaf. Louisa May Alcott fused transcendentalism into her masterpiece, Little Women, unlike the rest. And Emily Dickinson wrote poems on love, death, nature, and immortality. Lastly, the novelist William Gilmore Simms wrote on the South and is known as the Cooper of the South. Now, Frank, could you tell me about the most prominent American writers at this time?
I certainly can. The first one is Edgar Allan Poe, author of The Raven, and many other stories still famous today, even inventing the modern detective story in his Murders in the Rue Morgue. Meanwhile, other authors crafted works which reflected the Calvinist struggle of good versus evil, such as Nathaniel Hawthorne, who penned The Scarlet Letter, in which it was stated that we must be true to ourselves. Herman Melville penned his masterpiece, Moby Dick, an epic of American literature which features the titanic struggle of man versus nature. But Abe, can you inform me who penned the first edition of American Pageant textbook?
Frank, you may be a little ahead of the time period right now, but several American historians did emerge at this time. Most notably, George Bancroft, the father of American history, who wrote a super patriotic history of the U.S. William Prescott, another historian, published books on the conquest of Mexico and Peru, while Francis Parkman wrote on the conflicts between France and Britain. Overall, almost all American historians were New Englanders, and therefore much of our written history views the slavery-cursed South unsympathetically. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.
Comment down below if you have any questions, and we'll catch you guys next time.